So my topic is mute technique, and it's basically just a overall outlook on mutes, and especially with the trumpet, primarily for the trumpet. I started playing, as Steve said, when I was 9 years old, and almost immediately I was begging my parents to buy me mutes. And they couldn't understand why, and I couldn't understand why either, but for some reason, I was obsessed with buying mutes and trying them out. And actually, it's funny because I always make fun of my mom because when I do like Miles Davis tribute concerts, which, Miles Davis is really, he was known for playing with mutes. She always says, "Why do you have to play with a mute? I like the natural trumpet sound. Why use a mute?" And it's true, the natural trumpet sound can be the most beautiful thing, but mutes are very special in their own right. It's a way to alter our sounds. It's a way to kind of give another shape to our timbre. And this is important for various things. There are specific trumpet players that never used mutes, or hardly ever. That's because they had their voice and they wanted to have it sing through. But it's funny because it's not literally muting the trumpet. The sound is still coming through. So it's kind of a bad name for it. It's an altered sound, and that's kind of what we need to be thinking about. What kind of altered sound do we want to have come through? So first of all, know your mutes. Let's go through the main list of mutes. The first one is the straight mute, and that's this one. This is the most common, I'd say the most common in the history of all music, not just jazz. Actually, playing and studying classical music and playing in youth orchestras and things like that, I use this much more than in jazz. And for instance, Steve mentioned in his introduction the Spotify playlist that I put together that you can find on this page. It's called Trumpet Mutes in Jazz. So it was, there aren't many options to find this mute unless you're talking about more older style of jazz. I'm talking about the 20s and 30s, that kind of style. So for instance, the example that I put on the Spotify playlist was King Oliver, who, Louis Armstrong came up. If you don't know, Louis Armstrong was a prodigy, was a up-and-coming student of King Oliver's in New Orleans. And he was recruited to play in his band, and they traveled up north to Chicago. And then Louis Armstrong went on and did his own thing. So King Oliver started playing with a straight mute a lot in his recording. So you can hear that in what the options, the examples that I gave, and in other examples. So when Louis Armstrong started playing, he started playing with that same sound, obviously, because that was his mentor. And then eventually he got rid of the mute and he played his own free open trumpet. So this is, for instance, without the mute. This is with the straight mute. So it kind of has a nasally kind of thing. But if I put more energy into it, then it cuts through much more than a natural trumpet sound. That kind of sound, if you're playing, I always think about, in New Orleans and back in the day in the old juke joints or whatever, everybody's dancing. It's a crazy time. They don't have microphones, and everyone's on the stage is competing with each other. You got drums, you got trombone, you got everyone. So the trumpet, this is almost like a lethal weapon. It was already a lethal weapon, but as soon as you put this in, it becomes an even more lethal weapon. This can cut through severely. And if you listen to classical music, as a side note, it also has that effect. It's used as a way to cut through, have a more poignant sound, a more direct sound. So I usually use this mute for things like that. If I'm trying to sound like an older style or recreate an older style. That usually works for that, to get that kind of sound. So I don't use this one that often, but I carry, this is also important to talk about. I carry a mute bag that's big enough to carry all of the mutes that I need or could possibly use. So if I go to a recording session and they say, yeah, bring some mutes, I'm not just gonna grab a couple that I think I need. I'm gonna fill up my mute bag and bring it just in case. And sometimes they don't even know what the mutes are called. A lot of times they don't know what the mutes are called. They don't know what they want. So I'm gonna give them options. I'm gonna say, hey, listen to this one. Hear this one, you know, check this one out and see if this is what you want. And then I'll go to the next one and like that. So that's very important. Get a mute bag, get something that you can carry around that's durable, and then start your collection of mutes. This is very important. This is part of being a professional trumpet player or a trumpet player for hire, because this is part of our arsenal. Just like having a mouthpiece and all those, valve oil and all the other essential items. So that's the straight mute. Like I said, the King Oliver option is on there. The example is on there. So moving on to the cup mute. This is the classic cup mute. Humesburg cup mute, stone lined. It's completely different than the straight mute. Straight mute is metal. This is kind of a hard paper. I don't know what it is, but it's not metal. And there's no hole at the end. There's a hole like the straight mute, a hole at the other end. And then there's this is why it's called a cup mute, because there's that cup. And that creates a specific sound. On the playlist, I listed Dizzy Gillespie as one of the main players of this cup mute. And he plays Caravan. It's an amazing version. Check it out. Everything he plays, it's really fast and incredible. A lot of bebop and Latin rhythms. And he's playing on this cup mute. So what that does is, Dizzy was known for his loud, boisterous sound. And the cup mute is the opposite, I think, of the straight mute, because you can't cut through that much. It almost kind of makes the sound more opaque. So this is without. This is with the cup mute. So it's a slight difference, but honestly, there's a great trumpet player who's a legend in this area. He played with Harry Connick Jr. and Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra with Wynton Marsalis. His name is Dan Miller, and he's a great musician, great friend who lives down in Naples and plays really well. He was playing regularly there, and he almost always plays with this mute, and I really respect him for that, because it's really cool, because he's developed his own sound only with this mute, obviously with his own technique, but this is, every time you see him, any pictures you see, it'll be with this mute. So that's kind of become part of his sound. One thing I'd like to say is that also, when you're naturally, it might not be that obvious, but if you think about it, it is kind of obvious. If you're putting something at the end, if you're plugging almost the hole, what happens naturally with the air? You need to put more air into it, right? Immediately, with some mutes, more air is necessary than other mutes, but For instance, with the cut mute, I immediately feel that I need to put some more. So when I took it out, it was a lot easier. My air just kind of, it was the natural way that I play. But as soon as I put this mute in, I had to start putting more air through the horn. And that makes sense because I'm blocking the airway, right? So in order to get that proper sound with the mute, I need to put more air through it. I think that's really important to keep in mind, that it's not just an accessory. You're not just adding something to your horn that looks nice. It has to be thought of as an extension of your horn, so that you have to kind of think, all right, how am I going to manipulate this extension? How am I going to incorporate this into my own playing and my own airflow? And as we know, trumpet players, you know that airflow is extremely important. Direction of airflow, how much air, all of that is extremely important. So we need to think about that. When you pick up a mute in the middle of a show or in a gig and you put it in, you have to automatically change that chip in your head that says, all right, my air has to go a little bit faster. Another thing I'd like to talk about is intonation with mutes, that I think a lot of people don't think about, a lot of trumpet players don't think about especially. And we'll go on to the next mute, and this is a perfect example, the Harmon mute. This is the Harmon, I should say the Harmon style mute. This is actually a bubble Harmon style mute. And this is the sound, if you think of the classic Miles Davis sound, this is the basic kind of mute that he was using. And when I was talking about intonation, this mute is really hard to keep in tune. As soon as you put it in your horn, the intonation goes completely different. So what does that mean, trumpet players? That means that we have to, a lot of times it goes sharp when we put it in. So we have to pull out the slide. So I usually, I play about right here. This is for all the trumpet nerds like me. I play about right there. And if I put in the Harmon mute, I'm gonna pull out to about there. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry. But that's essential. If you have a Harmon mute and you're playing in a show, you're playing with other people, you're playing on a gig, whatever. If you're practicing by yourself, it doesn't really matter, but it is a good way to kind of get into it. So if you're practicing, make that a habit. Force yourself to push out a little bit on the tuning slide when you put the Harmon mute in, especially. Because the intonation is different. And that's because it's another, you're adding another thing, like I said before, another addition to your horn. And this is really closed off. There's not much space in there, right? So when you're doing that kind of thing, that changes immediately, that changes the intonation. Not only the sound, but the intonation. So what I would suggest is, if you don't already have one, get a tuner. Tuners are great for everything. As an all-around musician, you should always have a tuner. I downloaded a tuner app on my phone, which is great. It was free, which is even better. So anytime I'm worried about my intonation when I'm practicing, I just pull it out and check it. And if you play one note on the trumpet open and then put the mute in, play the same note, check the difference, and then change accordingly. Again, as Steve is saying, if right now, if you have any questions, please chime in. Don't hesitate. Ask away. I won't be offended. I'll be happy. So let's talk about the Harmon mute, the Harmon style mute. So this at the end is not very common when you see a trumpet player, or if you have a Harmon mute as a trumpet player, you probably don't use this piece that often. And I think a lot of trumpet players, they buy the Harmon mute and they throw this away. Please don't throw this away. You may never use it, but you never know. Keep it in your mute bag, the same bag that I was talking about. But You never know when you need it. Like I was saying about the straight mute, this is an older style sound when you have that in. This is the classic wah-wah. We think about the wah-wah as a plunger kind of thing. The wah-wah sound originated with the hand and the plunger, but then the next style was with this extension. So. So that's open. What I'm gonna do, I don't know if you noticed what I was about to do, is I blew on the bell, and I stuck it in. That part right there is so crucial especially for a harmon mute. For the other mutes, it's not that necessary because they fit pretty well. But with the harmon mute, it's pretty much the only one that has the cork. This is a cork ring around it. The only one that has the cork ring. If you go back to the straight mute, that has cork, but there's only three of those, right? Same with the cup mute. So for some reason, those kind of stick in better. You don't need to fog up the end of your horn. But with a harmon mute, you do. And the worst thing is when you're playing in for instance, a really beautiful, serene concert, and for instance, the violins are playing, and you have to put in your harmon mute quietly, and then you go to play and it falls on the floor, and the director hates you forever. You don't want that. So fog it up, put it in, give it a good twist, and that's the best way. This, honestly, like that will not, I'm very confident in my many years of playing, that will not fall off. That will not come out until I actually physically take it out. If I didn't fog up the end of the bell, I would never know if it would fall out or not, and I don't want to risk it. So this is with the extension. So it has a kind of an older sound, but not really that different from the other ones. This is where it comes in. Here's the wah-wah. Right? So that is a much older sound. If I wanted to play that style, and I'm talking about, if we're going to be really specific, maybe I could say 1930s and before, as far as that kind of style. Obviously, you can play it whenever and wherever you want, but I think historically, that's the kind of sound that this comes from. So that's called, this is the stem of the harmon. If we take that out, don't throw it away. If we take that out, then we have the harmon mute. This is the one that we're used to seeing and hearing. This is the one that Miles Davis made popular, also Dizzy Gillespie. And let's see, the example I gave for that one was Art Farmer. I mean, almost every trumpet player in the jazz history has used the harmon mute from the 40s on, especially. So the example I gave on the playlist that I made was Art Farmer, A Child Is Born. So this is the sound without the stem. this one has a mood of its own that's incredible. So, you know, my suggestion with the Harmon mute, I mean, if you listen to Dizzy the way he uses it, he'll play it as if he doesn't have a mute on at all, and um, he'll he'll cut through, as you know, because he had that power and everything. Miles would use this as a way to actually subdue everything, to make it, to create a mood. And I think everything changed after Miles started using this mute, because now when I think, all right, I'm going to create a Miles mood, this is the first thing I think about, because this is a great go-to. You can play fast and bebop and loud and all that. It's harder to play loud with this mute. Keep that in mind. This is the most taxing mute that you could use. So if you want to play a whole show with this loud and fast and all that stuff, this is a big challenge to use this mute. If you want to play some nice ballads, that kind of thing, this is ideal for that sound. Again, this is an option to change the texture, to change the timbre of your sound. You don't have to, but if you're going to, these are some options. So let's go back to the list. All right, so the bucket mute. The bucket mute is not that often used, and this is the most common version of the bucket mute. Looks a lot different than the other ones. So this one, you know, they call it a bucket for a reason. It looks like a bucket. And this is the one that does not, the first one that I've showed you, that does not fit into your horn. It kind of wraps around your horn. So you'll need two hands. You can't do a quick one hand thing like all the other mutes. So that goes on like that. Right? So if I play without it, and then back to it. Like I said, you need time to get this one on. So there's not a big difference with this sound, but it's kind of like a muffler almost. It's kind of, if I were to put my hand over my mouth, that kind of slight difference. So for instance, the last gig that I actually played, which was a quiet, intimate restaurant, small place. I didn't want to, I had a table, a couple that was having a romantic dinner right in front of me. And I didn't want to, blow them out. So I used this one almost all the night, the whole night. And it was enough to where my sound didn't change too much, but I could muffle it a little bit, and I wasn't just, yelling at them, but I was, playing what I wanted to play in the style I wanted to play, but it kind of brought the volume down. So this is the actual, for me, this is like one of the real versions of an actual mute to mute the sound. The other ones change the sound and mute it. This one kind of, I feel, is more of a muting of the sound, kind of brings that volume down. So this is a great option. This is traditionally a big band kind of mute. And speaking of big bands, actually, well, before I talk about that, the example I gave for this one was Wynton Marsalis. I think I gave this example on another playlist of a session that I gave, but his awesome version of When It's Sleepy Time Down South. And it's great because if you don't think about it, you won't realize that he's actually playing with a mute, because his sound is so beautiful always. But if you actually you know, think about it, you'll realize that it has the bucket mute. He has the bucket mute on. So it's just a nice muffled sound. So keep this in mind, trumpet players, for when you have those intimate concerts or gigs, or even if you just want to play, you know, in a practice room and just not cut through at all. This is not a cut through mute. So what I was going to say about big bands, you know, it's so cool reading big band music and how the composer or arranger chooses which mutes the trumpet should use. For instance, when they call for all 4 or 5 trumpet players in a big band to use a bucket mute, I think that's so cool because I know immediately that it's going to create this lush kind of like dark sound. It's not going to be that blaring classic big band sound. It's going to be all of a sudden this nice dark sound. So I'm always looking forward when I see bucket mute written above my, you know, my part. I'm like, okay, this is going to be kind of cool. So those add textures, you know, composers and arrangers write what kind of mute you want to use, they want to use for that texture. So if you're a trumpet player and you see that above your music, respect that. If it says bucket mute, that doesn't mean that they want you to blast through that bucket mute. They want you to use the bucket mute. Another bucket mute that I have is a metal version. That's the style of the other ones. The other mutes, not the other bucket mute. So it has those 3 cork things, and then it also has this weird cotton stuff in the inside, and that's all to kind of mute it all out. Yeah, it's weird, it's strange, but this is completely metal, all this. So this one has a brighter sound, but it still has that bucket mute kind of feel. So when I want to, I can cut through with this because I have that metal helping me out. All of this filling and all of that is trying to make it, you know, quiet and muted. But that metal allows me to cut through if I want to. So this is kind of like a hybrid bucket mute, if you will. Sometimes Wynton Marsalis uses this one, and I think it depends on what you want. I carry both in my mute bag because it depends on what it is called for. You know, like I said, if there's a big band chart and I know it's supposed to be lush and quiet and I have to blend, I'm going to use this one. If I want to cut through sometime at some point, I'm going to use this one. I remember recording something for or rehearsing something for Chuck Owen, who runs the big band at USF in Tampa, who's an amazing award-winning composer, and he knows his mutes, and bucket mute actually is one of his favorite mutes for the winds to use, for the brass to use. And I showed up with this one, and everyone else in the trumpet section had this one. And he immediately called me out and he said, no, that you're cutting through too much. So those little details are important. So I mean, these are investments you have to think about. I mean, these all cost money. I understand that, but you have to think about which one you want to use. And if you can, have both ready to use. Because you have to think about the music and you have to think about the texture and how you're gonna, what you're gonna bring to the texture. Let's see. Now the fun one, the plunger. This one, you know, I'll never stop getting weird looks when I pull this out at a random gig. It is actually a plunger. I get that question a lot. For most of you know that you know it is a plunger, but some people don't know. It's a toilet plunger, and it's crazy because I'm always on a quest to find the best toilet plunger. That's part of my life, which is really strange to admit. Every time I go to a hardware store or a Publix or whatever, I'm checking out the plungers. And obviously I throw away the stick that comes with it. I don't care about that. So this is the best one that I found so far. And if you can see, it has one of those lips. I mean, this is one of those heavy duty ones that you can open up, right? It's pretty big. And I cut a hole in the middle. And this is really common for plunger mutes, for plungers, because usually it doesn't have a hole, it's solid. And in that case, it's hard to keep the same note, the same intonation when you close it. So that note, I want it to be the same when I have the plunger on it. I want to have it be exactly the same, if not very close. A lot of times when that isn't cut out, when it's not hollow, it changes the note. And I don't want that. I want to change the note myself. I don't want this to change the note. So I cut that out. Be careful when you cut it out. Find a knife or whatever, but be careful. So I did that. And this is that sound. Right? And as soon as I start playing this, I start feeling bluesy and like I'm from the South, which I'm not, but so growls and flutter tongues and bending all help this sound out to become a more authentic sound. I could just do it with, without any effects. That works, but what I try to do is add effects to the plunger sound. Right? So I want to milk it for all it's worth. Now it's hard, it's hard to kind of get a hold of the plunger technique at first. What I do recommend is watching videos of the great plunger players. The first great players were in the Duke Ellington Orchestra. Cootie Williams, and there were many more. Now I can't think of them. Bubba Miley. And the example that I gave on the playlist was Clark Terry. He's playing Slow Boat to China with Oscar Peterson. And that's a completely different way of playing the plunger. But the traditional way is the way I just played, I think. So I think watching those players helped me out a lot, watching their technique. So the idea is to make it sound like a voice. So if we pretend that our mouths are the plunger, we would do wah 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 wah. So the wah starts wah wah wah, and I want to be as extreme and as obvious as possible. If I just do this wah wah wah, that won't do anything. I'm talking about wah 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 wah, right? So I want to get that wah wah sound. That means I have to close it and open it enough to get the wah wah, right? So if you're out of luck and you don't have a plunger on hand and you don't want to go to the bathroom and find one, you can pick up one of these, which I use occasionally, which actually sound great, a wine glass or any kind of glass. It's the same effect. also like a random cup. So go around your house and find any cups or glasses that sound, honestly, some sound amazing, some don't work. And it has the same kind of theory to what I was saying about the plunger, is that it can't change the sound too much when you close it. So find something that basically retains the same sound, the same intonation, I should say, changes the sound, retains the same intonation, and then try that out. Any questions? Any comments?
I don't see any, excuse me, James, I don't see any in the chat feature right now. I wanted to remind everyone, though, that you're going to be back with us on July the 16th for a session that you're calling Different Approaches to Swing, which is really open to all instruments. So I was going to ask if you could maybe comment on what to expect as part of that session or some thoughts that you had. But I also wanted to remind everybody that if they go to clearwaterjazz.com's education page, they can see all the upcoming sessions that are scheduled through this month and beyond. Some really great players. I'm excited to have back Pete Carney, who is a director of jazz down at the State College of Florida. And he has this really kind of neat take, this series he calls Safer at Home. And they're really practicing techniques that are open to all instruments, and he often offers some really cool session materials of things you can do to work on your craft from home. So I would encourage everybody to participate in those sessions. We've got some saxophone players with us, and for those students that are with us today, right after this session around 5:30, Kyle Schroeder, who's a student at the Frost School of Music in Miami, is going to be with us talking about sharing his experiences on aiming for a college jazz program and some things to consider, and maybe some tips from him. He's a wonderful player and someone who found his calling pretty early and has had a lot of drive to make himself better. And we're excited to have him with us. So anyway, James, I'll turn it back to you. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your upcoming class, and then I'll let you close us out.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, those are some great sessions. I can't wait to check them out. And thanks for having me again. So the upcoming session that I'm doing is really interesting to me, because it's something that I've been thinking about for a while, ever since I basically started listening and trying to play jazz, is that everyone talks about playing with swinging, but no one can describe exactly what swinging means, right? You can't put it into words, and you can't notate it. It's been impossible. There are two popular versions that are completely different of notating jazz. And they both don't come close to exactly how to notate or read jazz. So it's a completely audible thing, oral thing. So what I realized is that, for instance, some examples, Count Basie Orchestra and the Duke Ellington Orchestra are two of the most famous historic orchestras in jazz history, but they both have two completely different concepts of swing. If you, like I mentioned, Art Farmer, who was on today's playlist, the Spotify playlist, his swing is completely different than Lee Morgan's swing. So basically I'm going to make a list and give some examples of different approaches to swing. They all swing, they all sound amazing, and they're all legendary, but they are different. And it's kind of like a cool way to kind of figure out which one you want, or which avenue you want to go down. So that'll be basically what I'll be talking about on the next session. So any questions, please contact me on Facebook Messenger or at jamessuggs80@gmail.com for more questions about today's session on mutes. If you have any questions about what kind of mutes to use or what brands to buy, please let me know, and I'll try to help you out. As always, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much for tuning in, and thanks to Steve and all those at Clearwater Jazz Holiday for having me once again. Appreciate it.